Thank you so much, Kimberly, for being with me today on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You're my 97th guest on my podcast. How are you today?
I am great. 97. That's impressive.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure having you on the show and discussing relationship building, what it means to you, and what has it meant for your professional career. Before we begin, I'd like to, for my audience, give an introduction and a background of who you are. For 8 years during President Obama's administration, you were a diplomat at the U.S. Department of State. You were Director of Human Resources for Mariposa County in Mariposa, California. The same role, Director of Human Resources in Fairfield, California for Solano County, Vice President of People, Culture, and Compliance, Walker Advertising, Chief Advancement Officer and Spokeswoman at End Workplace Abuse, Board Member at Workplace Fairness, and currently you are the founder and principal of the Fair Path Project. And we have spoken a lot offline about the excitement of starting this company and involving working with you and helping grow the company. When you think of relationship building in a team environment, what does it mean to you? What has it meant for your professional career? And what excited you about starting the Fair Path Project and seeing all the great and wonderful potential of where it's going to go?
Yeah, so much to start. One, thank you so much for having me. Really, really excited to be here. Love working in teams, particularly HR teams. I'm all heart when it comes to people. It's why I went into human resources because I care about people so deeply. And I think, like my approach to teams and work and everything else is kindness and courage always. That, no matter how other people may show up, whether they're having a good day or a bad day, I can own how I show up. And I don't think that, messy human complicated situations need to always be so bad, so ugly, and there's ways to diffuse things, and there's ways to show up in a way where we don't have to raise our voice, but we can still speak our truth, and we can do it in a kind way, and a lot of times it's a more effective way. And that's kind of what we bring into the Fair Path Project, which I deeply, deeply love because we're taking on some of the most complex challenges that aren't talked about and saying these things out loud and trying to teach other people to say them out loud too has been a joy.
Yes, absolutely. And talk to me about how your career started and what made you want to follow the path of diplomacy and working as a U.S. diplomat at the U.S. State Department. What inspired you to follow the path working in the public sector for our federal government? And how did you come across the opportunity of become a diplomat?
So it was a long, windy road because I'm 54 this year. So it didn't start in a traditional way. I was a little kid that saw Indiana Jones and wanted to be an archaeologist. And I did that. I actually got a master's degree in underwater archaeology and learned very quickly that that's not a career. It's actually an expensive hobby. And I wouldn't say it's like not the most useful degree. My mom certainly cried pretty hard when I said I was coming home and going to grad school for this. But there's really only 2 things you can do with it. You can go teach or you can work in museums. Most people don't survive in the field that long. And so I actually taught in Tampa, where I know you're from, at Hillsborough Community College. I taught there for 7 years. I came down to Florida for the diving and ended up teaching US history, which I really, really loved. There's just so much drama, so many great stories, so much conflict. Loved helping students fall in love with the subject when they weren't originally in love with it and to talk about why it's so relevant for their lives. But while I was working there, I was still traveling the world quite a bit. And even when I was underwater archaeologist in Egypt, I met my first US diplomat and she had talked to me about, considering, joining this. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm like this poor dirty hippie who goes diving and she's this beautiful, elegant woman. I'm like, we're on 2 different planets. But then as I was doing archaeological work in the summers in China and Tibet, I was working with this one program that also had retired diplomats in it. And they kept saying, you should apply for this test. You should apply. Just give it a shot. So I was like, okay. I heard it was a history test, and it is. And so I didn't tell a soul that I was going to take this test because it would be very embarrassing for me as a tenured professor in US history to fail that test. So I just went one morning on a Saturday, took the test and passed it, and then just kept going through the process and ended up going into the State Department thinking I was going to do educational work. I had deliberately signed up for what they call a public diplomacy track. And so, you work with the press, you work with museums and culture and gave a lot of lectures and, work in the educational sphere. In my first tour, I was sent to Siberia, and that's what I did. I would go speak all over the central part of Russia, a territory the size of India, and, talk about the United States and talk about our systems and host cultural events and did all these great things. And then soon after that, I was placed into a management officer position in HR. And at first, I was horrified. I was like, I'm a liberal arts major. You can't do this to me. Like, what's happening? But I fell in love with it on day one. It took me out from behind this podium where I was talking to 1,000 people, and there was kind of this emotional disconnect as much as I tried to connect with these folks to these one-on-one moments where I was there on the best days of people's lives and the worst days of people's lives. And, I one day I would be informing somebody that they are moving their family to Paris and that they're going to go spend the next 3 years there. And there's this great adventure. And the next day I'd be dealing with a crying parent whose child was diagnosed with brain cancer, and we're having to get them home and, helping them through processes like that. And it was so meaningful, I never looked back, and I've just stayed with HR ever since.
Yes, and quite a resume in terms of, places that you got to visit and with speaking engagements and traveling to different parts and really getting immersed in the cultural aspects of how people live and how people work and how people function. What was so introspective for you, or what did you truly find meaningful in all those experiences and the types of relationships that you have today that you created back then?
I think for me, a central thread that comes out through everything is stories and how we bond through stories and connect through stories. Our brains are wired for them. There's a reason why we respond to them. They're ancient. There's just something that we can connect with. And what was really interesting about my journey, I think in particular, is what I learned with teaching a bunch of 18-year-olds history was it was all about the stories. And I don't know if you know any 18-year-olds, they're not nice people. And so they'll tell you if they're bored with something, they're not going to sugarcoat it or sit there politely. And they're a really challenging audience. And I kind of like that because it made me do better. It made me work harder. It made me strive to connect with them. And a lot of that would happen when I would get into like these really nitty gritty stories. And there would be these moments where the room would become so still because I knew that they were waiting to hear what was going to happen next for the story. And I feel like, the work translates into HR and other areas when we get into that space of what's going to happen next. How can I connect you? How can I see with you? How can I be there in this moment as part of your journey? And how can I find those words to build that bridge between you and me so that you're supported in whatever way that needs to be? And I think that that's something that's always been missing from HR, that we don't know how to tell good stories necessarily. Like some people stumble into it. But I think one of the things I'm so grateful for as my work, from teaching and from the really tangible training that I had with the State Department is all your words matter. And striking that right tone with your words can be so, so powerful.
Of course, and being that you are a diplomat, you're representing our country in the highest capacity, at the highest level, in the highest form of professionalism, sophistication. It's an amazing act of service. It's a wonderful act of service to be able to go to different parts of the world and represent our country, showing true patriotism. I mean, you essentially were a patriot, and you are, but you were in that role as well, being a diplomat. And diplomacy is matters so greatly, especially in times like these where we live in a polarized society and there is a lot of division, unfortunately and tragically. So, when you were a diplomat during the Obama years, throughout his presidency, 8 years from 2009 to 2017, what were your messages, rather, in terms of, if people asked you and if they gave their impressions of the US, how did you bridge their impressions with reality, and what was your messages to them, and the types of diplomatic relations that you formed, what were your thoughts on how you wanted to achieve your objectives and making sure that diplomatic relations were the strongest it could possibly be?
I think, so much of it is that relationship before. things happen. It's the breaking of the bread, the quiet conversations, the getting to know, hey, is that your family on your desk? Tell me about them. It's that real human experience that is built up in so many places so that when incidents occur, when disagreements or conflict occur, that you're able to connect with that person beyond just that moment and that you have something established ahead of time that can be really, really helpful. I know in some instances you're dealing a lot with like perception and media and just State Department, I don't know if they still do this, but for years they monitored every bit of media all over the world, and it wasn't because we thought that that was the truth of what was happening on the ground, but we were kind of looking at it to see what people were being fed. And, with that, we would have better context of what their perceptions may be, and then building narratives to fill in those gaps. And so I know at one point I was like a press person in Ghana, and it was right after the Supreme Court had upheld same-sex marriage. And there was a lot of fear in African countries in particular because they were really charged around this idea that donor states may start pressuring them to accept same sex marriage in order to keep getting funding. And there was this nasty, awful backlash, and there was a case in Accra where a man who was suspected of being a homosexual was dragged out of his store and beaten an unbelievable amount of times. And I remember going down to this dock late at night and meeting with about 100 men who were closeted gay men sharing these horrible experiences about, police were raping them, taking advantage of, they know their secret. And if they know that if they out them, that they would meet the same fate as this guy. And I remember pleading with these guys, trying to say, like, there could be protection here. There's ways we want to work with you. There's ways we want to help you. We don't want you to become targets of anything that's occurring in the United States. And I'll never forget that conversation because I couldn't convince them. They're like, well, we see the news. We see what happens. We see, the bad things that happen to gay men in the United States, and we don't trust you. We don't believe you. And so looking at that history and what we're working against when those narratives come out can be really significant. And I think one of the things that may surprise a lot of folks in the United States is you could have some obscure state senator in the middle of Wyoming make a small comment at a breakfast with 8 people about, Honduras, and it may not make any news here, but it could take over media in Honduras for 3 months and really shape things in ways people don't realize.
That's unbelievable and it doesn't surprise me because around the world, each country is tuned into what's happening in the United States and following all the media outlets and what messaging is going out or how we're handling crises at home domestically. Because if any of those crises affect them abroad in any way, shape, or form, and they could apply those crises in their own countries, they're going to be very much attuned to that. When you think of your role in human resources and a lot of what you learned and a lot of what you experienced, on the job as a US diplomat, how was the transition in human resources working for Mariposa County and Solano County? What led you from DC to California? And although, one is the public sector at the federal level, and then now you're working at the local level, county level in the most populated state in the country, California. So tell me about those experiences and from the State Department to California.
It's definitely an interesting transition. And a lot of it was just from my kid. I was a single mom and we had these great experiences that I was so proud of. I mean, she would do Russian press interviews at 2 years old and go on stage with me in front of thousands of people and speak. And I remember when she was 3, we climbed Tiger's Nest in Bhutan together. She learned how to surf off the coast of Africa. And while I thought this was like a dream childhood, she did not. And so for her, what was really exciting and exotic was, she would point to the TV and say, how come those kids get to live in one house their whole life? And I want that. I want sleepovers. I want Girl Scouts. That was like her dream. And so California just seemed like a great transition out of that because it, would give her roots and some sense of permanence. And, it was still like this beautiful state to explore and to go see. And I remember when I left the federal government, I was warned by a couple of folks. They're like, "Oh, be careful about these smaller agencies because at the federal level, you have so much scrutiny. You've got, every major news outlet is breathing down your neck. They're sending you FOIA requests. There's kind of a check on that you don't see with smaller agencies. They tend to fly under the radar, particularly in these more remote places. And so right off the bat, it was really interesting when I arrived, particularly at first in this kind of rural community. And within, I think, the first couple of months, heard, and this is on public record, this is in recordings, racist comments, sexist comments. And, I was stunned by this. And I remember a board member who did that and going and knocking on their door saying, we need to have a conversation, and just the shock on their side for being called out on that. And, the interesting dynamics of going from this space where I worked with a lot of colleagues who were high integrity, didn't care what pay grade somebody was. They didn't care if you were an ambassador, they were going to call you up and, let you know what they think about this if they were behaving in a way that wasn't with integrity. And then now I'm running my own shop and dealing with these folks. And very quickly, my head's on a chopping block, and I'm trying to figure out how to navigate of, I'm in the room, I hear things happening in the room. Who am I if I don't say something? But also painfully aware that like my job's in jeopardy every time I engage in this space. And so while there were some unpleasant moments with that, I learned so much from it, not just in terms of like how to protect myself, but how to potentially protect other people. And it's a big part of why I've started the Fair Path Project is those learnings from those years about how to hold your ground and how to lean on the law and how to lean on resources from outside an organization, which is why I've created courses specifically for HR, because they're in that unique place where they have access to that privileged information. They have access to these private conversations. So how can they show up in a safe way to protect others when their job's being threatened? Because that's not something HR normally teaches, but a lot of that I did learn as a diplomat. And then spreading that to everyone else. There's actually a very simple formula for how to hold bosses accountable, and nobody talks about it and nobody knows it. And I want to change that.
Absolutely. And, throughout your relationship building experience as a professional, as a whole, you are a very empathetic person. You have a lot of empathy. You care about people. You want to help people. Even with your experiences and what you have gone through, it has allowed you to then, with the Fair Path Project, be in the position of improving human resources. And I love how you've come up with a formula in your mind, and whether you feel that it's unique or whether you feel that it takes certain elements from different areas and places, that you're able to see what was lacking in yesteryear, and now you can take your experiences and fine tune it and make it where it's applicable to everyone, and that it really covers all the bases. You, I'm sure, dotted your I's and crossed your T's, coming up with a certain regimen that, really will have people respond well to it. So, with these courses, what in particular have you focused on or highlighted where you felt that in your previous roles in HR and in other capacities where you felt, okay, this is what needs to be taught because it's not really explained, to your point, there's no real rule book or guidance or North Star, if you will.
Thanks for asking that. Like this, the centerpiece of everything I do is called the Fear Not framework. And I actually spent a lot of time focusing on fear because over 50 million people have been bullied at work in the United States. I think it's like 78 million have experienced it either as a bystander, so they've witnessed it, which also has its own form of harm if they haven't experienced it directly. And so we've got decades and decades of these awful things that we can all point to of, oh yeah, I know Bob was bullied and Bob tried to say something and he was fired immediately, or somebody tried to stand up for somebody else and it didn't go well for them. And so there's this chilling effect that's created this power imbalance that locks a lot of stuff in place. And it's only through diving deeper into that fear that we can begin to unravel that, because there's now so much more science and research out there that I think is so helpful for people. One, even just bystander studies, that are showing that if we see someone at work who's humiliated, harmed, and then nothing's done, a lot of people will kind of back away from that person reflexively. They don't want to be part of that. But at the same time, too, if they see someone who's bullied and that person turns around and they hold their ground and they're calm and they're like, no, I'm not accepting this. You're wrong. And they push back. It has the same effect on folks where they now feel safer to do that themselves. But we also see too, particularly like in spaces where we all know something's wrong and we don't say anything. There was a study done recently about whistleblowers. It was a global study, international study that was saying that on average, only 5% of people who witness things that are really bad are willing to say something. So it's a really small number of those who come forward, even when we all see it, even when we all know it. And they said that the reason why that number is so small is because years and years, thousands of years of evolutionary development in our brain is that we register social isolation as intense pain for understandable reasons, right? For most of human history, social isolation could be a death sentence. So it just wasn't worth saying, hey, this isn't right. And I would be willing to wager, even though I don't have any data to point to this, it's more acute in a place, or it's uniquely acute in a place like the United States where we don't have these social safety nets. And this is further kind of backed up by the work of Dr. Jen Frazier, because she's taken brain scans of folks who've been bullied at the workplace and brain scans of combat veterans, and they're identical. It actually leaves scars on the brain because it's so terrifying in the American context. If you're an older person, if you're in such a specialized field that you can't just jump from something else. So, in other words, like if you're not a teenage kid working at a Burger King who's like, oh, well, I'll go work at McDonald's, there can be immediate impacts for your ability to pay rent, for your children. And so it does very quickly feel like you're in fight or flight, you're in survival mode. And so it's so, so critical to see that for what it is and to respond in a way that can help there.
Wow, that's unbelievable. And, we've spoken offline about this, that I've been bullied in school, elementary, middle, and high school, in college early on, just one particular instance. And, I experienced it even in places that I've worked at. So when you point to combat veterans and people who have been bullied compared to, or, associated with combat veterans who went to war and saw horrible, despicable things, that the scars are the same, with brain imaging. And I know that it's painful for people to talk about their experiences, and you've had your experiences, and, there's a safe space, obviously, to share what you can publicly that you're able to share. But given what you just pointed out to, it seems to me that whether it's you or me or others, we all have then scars in different respects, meaning that there are people who have been bullied, there are people who went to war, there are sadly and tragically women who have been abused by spouses, domestic abuse, workplace abuse. And, that just tells me unscientifically why there are so many people in our country who have, sadly, maybe they have addiction problems, or maybe they take medicine for various reasons. And then you combine that with just the way the media landscape, that it's all out there in terms of, certain stimuli, a lot of exposures to different things, and just a fast paced environment, and the stressors that people develop, especially what we see on television and what has happened in Minneapolis the past few weeks, and how just that one, or two isolated incidents are really a microcosm of what's happening, nationwide or even around the world. And then, what you think about what happened in California last year with the fires and the emotional scars of people losing their homes or businesses and having to relocate, just everything we've seen with this presidential administration, just how, again, going back to Minneapolis, or the idea that we as American citizens have to be fearful and look over our shoulders depending on where we live, or what we might look like, or things of that nature, because of this Department of Homeland Security's ICE and CBP, of how they're conducting raids, or how they are infringing upon people's, First Amendment rights. And Now, in this case, Alex Pretty, his Second Amendment rights to bear arms, he did not brandish a weapon by any means. He was just trying to help a woman, help her up after being pushed by a federal agent. So there are scars literally being formed every day. And with the Fair Path Project, I'm sure it makes you wonder when you feel that, wow, I've thought of everything, in terms of how people are going to respond in the workplace or how people are going to deal with the situation in the workplace, that there are even things outside of the workplace that have nothing to do with professional life, but that people are experiencing these emotional tolls that are beyond even the control of the Fair Path product. So, how do you compartmentalize, or how do you just think of like different scenarios or just different aspects of like our lives as humans and say, what more can be done if you feel like, oh, I thought of everything. I'm trying to help as many people as I can, but what else can I do given the state of the world and the state of our country?
You raise such a good point. There's a lot of unprocessed trauma out there that can come from childhood, it can come from anywhere, and it's going to show up at work. We spend a lot of time with each other when we're working, and these things can be there, and we even see patterns where, people may be quote healthy and not have any issues, but then work traumatized them and then they carry that forward. And so what I'm really loving as a movement right now is this kind of pivot from feelings, which in America we just do such a bad job with. Like we treat feelings like it's nothing, like it's not tangible, it's not real. When the truth of the matter is, it shows up in suicide, it shows up as cancer, it shows up in failed marriages, debts, financial ruin, homelessness, very tangible things, but we're still not acknowledging it. And, the way we invest in mental health is kind of a reflection of that. But two things that I think are kind of countering that. One is the shift in HR to simply go about how folks feel and these nebulous things that may be hard to get your arms around to very strict scientific risk mitigation strategies. And so, a good friend of mine, David, he had a book come out called Psychological Hazards Are Real. Retired firefighter, and he uses ISO standards, so international safety standards that have been researched for many years. We're starting to see this breakout in the insurance field, dealing with employee relations and employee payouts for, bad things that companies may have done. And all of that is getting into a risk mitigation strategy where he's applying the same thing to risks that people put themselves in harm's way. And so he uses the example, obviously, as a firefighter, since he was one. And, like that is very serious. Fires are very scary. They can really hurt you. And so there's so much training that goes into like, okay, if you're going to enter this burning building, here's all the skills that you need to have. Here's all the equipment that we're going to provide you. And so what he's trying to do is take some of this kind of OSHA language and apply that in a psychological context and say, first, we have to acknowledge that it's real. And then how do we want to equip people to manage that? How do we want to deal with discipline? How do we want to deal with employee relations when it is immensely complicated? And, that it could be where all parties are contributing to a problem. Okay, so let's not run from that. Let's dive into that. Let's do the best we can to figure that out and make sure we're coming up with something that's kind and clean and consistent for everyone across the board. So I think there's some really beautiful work that's being done there. But second, all of this, and we have a bully in the White House, we've got bullies running all of our federal agencies. It's all about abuse of power. And so a lot of what's holding so much of this in place is that chill that comes about retribution and people not wanting to speak up because they feel like they're going to go into a battle that they're going to lose, and figuring out how to say these things out loud. And I'm also seeing a lot of beautiful movements happen there. When I first started talking about my own abuse story, and I want to acknowledge you too, Garrett, like there's so much courage that comes in you sharing that story. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart that doing that. The more people that come forward, the better off we all are. There's nothing to be ashamed of here. I'm not ashamed of it. Nobody should be ashamed of it. We should be talking about it so that it doesn't continue to happen to other folks. But when I first started sharing my story, nobody was talking about it. Now, every morning when I log on to LinkedIn, there's like 1,000 posts about institutional harm. Here's a copy of the letter that my boss just sent me. I was just burned. And they're not hiding it anymore, and they shouldn't be. The abuser should be ashamed of this behavior, and they're banking on silence in order to continue with that behavior. And so I think we're going to see a big reckoning. I think we're starting to see that in Minneapolis right now, where People are fed up with this kind of grotesque abuse, and it's gone to such an extreme place where somebody's being shot in the back 10 times. And then the gaslighting, which granted it's worse when we're dealing with, I can only call this a homicide, but we see that same thing in abusive relationships. We see that thing, whether it's domestic or whether it's at work or whatever, that people are building up not just the words, of vocabulary, but they're calling that stuff out in a way that's very, very encouraging and that's going to create some accountability. And so the Fair Path Project, what I'm working on is specific mechanisms to really drive that harder and further and faster. And so one example is, yes, I have this training that teaches HRs the exact skill they need to hold on to their integrity and to push back when they're being punched down at, to do something they know is unethical, and to teach everyday employees how to also do that in a space where they may not be safe, how to pull in leverage from the outside. But then even with employers themselves, because last year I did an HRCI teleconference with a panel, 70,000 participants, and I'm teaching them how to sue their boss. And I love that. And then I go to conferences with a bunch of healthcare administrators and say, I just taught 70,000 people how to sue you. So you can either try and do things better. We can start saying things that you all know are true and to be happening out loud and actually finally address them. Or you're going to be facing a risk that you don't want to be facing, and building that leverage into a national conversation that hopefully comes without something horrific happening like we just saw, but just simply saying people are just tired of the abuse.
Yes, and it's so tragic. It really breaks my heart that there are people like you and me and others who have experienced this. I mean, when I think of the people who bullied me, going back to, my adolescent years or my formative years, if you diagnose or a medical professional were to diagnose that person, inside of them, they feel like they've been bullied in some way, shape, or form. So it's almost as if, what does it take for a person who may have been a target of bullying from someone else, but then take that experience and then want to bully other people to make them feel better? And I truly can't understand that. I'm not saying that's across the board that that's everybody's experience or situation, but you know, because I was a recipient of that bullying from other people, it was never in no way, shape, or form my mentality to do the same thing to somebody else. That's not who I am, and that's not who you are. So the psychological profile of each individual, even if their experiences at one time or another were the same, where some people, take that and they want to do it to somebody else, where the other person doesn't want to do that and they want to be advocates and they want to stop that. They don't want to be a conduit to more abuse toward other people. So I find that to be, very interesting. And it is a tragedy that we have someone like President Trump in the White House for a second time, who is the ultimate bully, and that he has people in his administration who are bullies themselves. And when I think of having a 3-year-old and then another one on the way, and then you have a daughter in high school, and we have the ability to teach our children at home, right versus wrong, what to do versus what not to do, and teach them to be model citizens and teach them professionalism and etiquette and honesty and integrity and compassion, empathy, and following the rule of law and just being good, honest, hardworking people, being good citizens and being good stewards of the country and the world. We have that control in a healthy sense. We have the ability to be those mentors and be those guiding lights to our children. But at the same time, it's unfortunate that we have to overcompensate because throughout history, in terms of America, I mean, especially in modern times, and I'm sure, this goes back to our nation's founding of how we were founded as a country, that, we as citizens, have representation and the people rule. And for the first time in 250 years, that rule is being taken away from us. And we are, as a society, being subjected to non democratic and really a very harsh and abusive and abrupt and abrasive style of governing that has never existed in our nation's history. So we as adults have to teach our kids that's not what you follow. That's not who you look up to. That's not who you emulate. And it's pretty tragic that we have to teach our kids that, unfortunately, when it comes to President Trump and this administration, that's not a leader and shouldn't even be called a leader, but that is not a person that you should be emulating. This is not a President Biden. This is not a President Obama. This is not a President Bush. This is not a typical president who is governing. So I'm sure you think about that as well with the Fair Path Project and you being right in DC, that what you and the Fair Path Project are trying to do is the complete opposite. It's trying to solve problems and it's trying to come up with cures of what is transpiring at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
There's one thread through all of it, and it's accountability. We're missing accountability. And so the framers of the Constitution, I mean, we've all had that history lesson, I believe, that it was about checks on power and checks and balances, and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so building out that framework that was designed to go against a king who feels like he's behaving a lot like the person that we have in the White House right now. But we've struggled with that for a long time. We've always kind of had two Americas, one for one class and another for another. And we've seen that our judicial system, the UN's been hammering us for decades on, rich people have one set of systems and protections and everybody else has something different, and it gets worse for communities of color. And I think we see that in the employment setting as well. If you're an hourly employee, the janitor, and you violate even the tiniest policy, you're out. But, if you're the brother of the CEO or his college roommate or, her brother-in-law, it's a very different set of circumstances, and a lot of those things that sit above HR kind of go out the window. And so I do think, we're seeing a little bit of accountability come up now. Folks are pushing back out of Minneapolis. People are screaming from one end of the country to the other. I'm not a big fan of things going on with the Senate Democrats. I feel like they could have done some more stuff, but we're starting to see that happen now. And we're even seeing softer language come up out of the White House. There's reports of people being pulled out of Minneapolis. I can't confirm or, whatever is happening there, but we're seeing a backing down. Just like what we saw with tariffs and plenty of times over the last year, these horrible things happen and then they're reversed when there's pressure that comes from the people. So I think that same context can apply in so many other areas. And at Fairpath, of course, we stay focused on the workplace and hoping to see that same momentum here of saying, this outrageous gap that has come up between CEO pay and frontline pay. And they're saying that there's nothing that could be done about it. And we've got all these billionaires that are sitting there that are well supported. And that on any given night, you're now having over 700,000 people who are sleeping on streets. You have people, over 9 million Americans work two jobs just to try and survive. And so people aren't asking for unreasonable things. Having your dignity at work is not an unreasonable ask. Being actually able to pay bills for working 40 hours a week is not an unreasonable ask. And so I think people are going to recognize their power this year and hopefully be pushing back on a whole bunch of different fronts.
Of course, and you're exactly right. It has been a tale of two Americas, I mean, for decades. I mean, when you think back to the Civil War, the Union had to win for us to be one nation, right? Under President Lincoln's leadership. And then in the Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson administrations, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, desegregating schools, and women's suffrage was a big thing right after the turn of the century. And what we've seen really with the recent years of the Me Too movement and people speaking out and women speaking out about their experiences, and that it's not okay. It's terrible the way that women are being treated. And you and I have talked about, there are men, whether it's ego or pride, they don't want to feel embarrassed, but I'm glad that men are speaking out too about what their experiences are, because then it shows that solidarity amongst, men and women of all walks of life and people who obviously identify in other capacities. But I just hope that, with what is going on, Renee Good, Alex Pretty, and what we've seen in so many terrible circumstances, even going back during the Obama years and even the Bush years, where people of color have been targeted by law enforcement. And I know that we've seen undocumented immigrants. There are rare cases where they commit heinous acts. So, what I don't like is the fact that you can point to maybe one particular situation and then instead of just media outlets, taking an incident and reporting on it, they want to paint a broad brush and say, well, this is how it is everywhere. But I really think that each individual incident should be looked at in the appropriate context because there are things that happen where some things happen that are representative of more frequency and there are things that happen that may happen rarely, but when you look at it in totality, and it's the media that is constantly bombarding us with information about what's happening on a daily basis. People are confused. Okay, how much of one category is really happening versus how much of the other category is really happening, because when you think of just what we've experienced and seen in Minneapolis the past few weeks of, the two murders of two US citizens, both 37 years old. I'm 37 years old. I'm a US citizen. If God forbid, if it could happen to Renee Good, if it could happen to Alex Pretty, I mean, it can happen to anybody of any age, of any walk of life. So we just have not seen that in that manner, on full display in that type of context up until a few weeks ago. Now, I'm not trying to be naive because I know that during the civil rights era and during Dr. Martin Luther King's time, I mean, there was terrible, horrible things happening to the African American community, to Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and even white America too. I just think that everybody as humans, we're all equal. So what happens to a white person should be classified in the same manner as what happens to an African American person or Hispanic person, meaning that abuse is abuse, inequality is inequality. Treating people with disrespect and harming people, targeting people, speaking ill of people, people who harass others, there are no barriers in terms of what they may look like or whom they aspire to be or what their beliefs are. It should be looked at equally across the board, and therefore there should be a universal solution across the board. It shouldn't be where everybody of different walks of life, depending on who they are and what their backgrounds are and where they come from and what they believe in, it shouldn't be that their situation is handled differently than somebody else's situation. Everybody's situation should be handled the same and equally. And in terms of like it being the right solution, it should be a solution that applies to everyone that we have to solve. And in the Fair Path project, and understanding how HR is and understanding how critical it is to make sure that these companies are abiding by the same laws or guidelines within a company and that everybody should be treated the same, having their voice be heard. And that is to me the challenge of keeping it straight, of how not to leave anybody out and feel that they're discriminating some of their employees versus others if certain people are getting special treatment, which shouldn't be.
I certainly wish we were in a better place, but I think, fundamentally it all comes down to what people can get away with and what they think they can get away with. And I do think it's different and it is worse for some individuals than others. Like when you look at a lot of the work of DEI, it actually helped white women more than it helped anybody else. And there was so much disingenuous effort. In other words, we never truly had the buy-in of a lot of CEOs and a lot of boards. And that really became evident, once there was a change of administration and they dropped everything like a hot potato. And that's where I see like a lot of HR, a lot of DEI practitioners is like they're kind of caught in that middle space where they were never really supported to begin with. And so, a lot of times what'll end up happening is you have one HR person or, maybe you have one person who's committed to DEI and they may be the only woman in a room full of executives. They may be the only person of color in a room for executives. And so they're really not kind of walking into a safe space where if they do open up and they do say something, they probably don't have backup the way somebody else might especially have. And so I think, in terms of like, getting to that place, because you're right. Like if a CEO does a bad thing, they should be held accountable just like anybody else. But we don't have that. And that's because HR is not independent. There's no accountability mechanism. There's nothing outside that organization that's holding them there other than sometimes social pressure. Or, maybe if the news releases something, and that can be very real. We've seen one of the things we look at from an anti-abuse perspective is Gretchen Carlson and Julie Rodnitsky of Lift Our Voices. They've got some really good data on their Lift Our Voices website that talks about how if a public company has a bully boss or a boss that's sexually harassing someone or doing something really bad, and it goes public on a mainstream media site, share prices can drop up to 5% in one day. And it's starting to trigger, shareholder derivative suits where, not because maybe ethic or moral reasons, but you've hurt their investment. And now they're going after boards to say, did you know about this? And if you did, why didn't you do anything? But it's taking these more extraordinary acts to kind of create that accountability. And a lot of it's a fundamental flaw of the system. The reason why they're not as worried about the hourly employees, because the lower the paycheck, the lower the power, the lower, they rank, the less liability there is. So if a janitor does something bad, you discipline them, the case is kind of closed. If a CEO does something bad, then if they admit wrongdoing, are they now open up to a $5 million lawsuit? Well, they're going to do everything they can to either say they didn't do anything wrong, or if it's so ridiculous and they know they did something wrong and they can't get out of gaslighting you or making you go away, they'll come up with a remedy like an executive coach or some other BS mechanism that doesn't do anything and say, oh, well, that's not really governed, and you see this a lot in PR circles. We follow the law, which means nothing because the law is not there to protect anything. And so we'll see folks try and scapegoat accountability through all these snaky backdoor maneuvers. And that's a big thing I'm committed to, is taking all those quiet conversations and bringing them into the bright light of day.
You would know where this nationwide implementation is or could be, but does there exist today a governing body, or has there been any discussion of a governing body of having a universal HR policy for all companies? And does that need to be legislated in Congress?
I love where you're going with that, because I hear that from a lot of folks who are like, we just need more policies. No, we don't. We have policies. They're working around those policies. So we have to address that power imbalance. And there's been a couple of thoughts there. There are some folks who are championing, and I'm not entirely opposed to, outside accreditation for HR. So, like, if you look at the American Bar Association, it started out because everyone hated lawyers. And so they came up with their own way to govern themselves, to set up ethics, to control themselves that's outside of the place of their employment. And so it can put an attorney in a little bit of a better spot to say, hey, I can't agree with this. This could end my career if I go along with you on this. And so that they're given a talking point HR is not. I personally am a big supporter of legislative action, because you had mentioned before the Civil Rights Act, which can be really, really helpful for a lot of folks, but it is pretty out of date, and it's definitely time to be revisited, because right now, if you go to the EEOC, they have very clear definitions of what harassment looks like. There's no ambiguity, even though we all know it. People would like to try and pretend that they don't know what it is. But it's, if somebody humiliates you at your job, they're screaming at you, they're barring you from meetings, and they're impacting your ability to do your job, which is a really key component. That is a definition of harassment. The problem is right now it's connected to protected characteristics. So if you can't prove that somebody was doing that to you based on race, gender, ethnicity, whatever your protected characteristics may be in your area, you don't have a claim. And so that's where it becomes really frustrating, because in 2026, somebody can bully me, but they're not going to say, hey, Kim, I am bullying you because you're a woman. So they're probably smart enough to not say that part out loud. So now I'm in the position of trying to become a mind reader and trying to prove their intent, which is damn near impossible. Worse is if they're mean to you and me, well, then there's definitely no case. They're an equal opportunity abuser, and that's lawful. And so, in workplace abuse has been working for years to pass the Workplace Psychological Safety Act. And we've started conversations with congressional staffers, with the HELP committee. We've been working in different states and jurisdictions, including Washington, D.C., And the intent of this bill is to decouple those two things, to say harassment is a form of harm, and you should be able to have a private right of action to sue your employer if they hurt you in this manner. If you bring it to them and they do nothing, and you don't have to prove that it was because of your skin color, your origin, whatever that may be, but that the harm by itself is sufficient for an action.
Well, that's very interesting because even if one can't prove another person's intent, the act of someone bullying someone else, doesn't the bullying alone take precedent over the intent?
Should,
And but it doesn't because
because the law is written in a way where it has to be tied to protected characteristics.
interesting. So you mean that someone's feelings of how they were treated by somebody else, that if one person experiences but nobody else does, sadly, is it a he said, she said type of thing? Like that person would then have to find another person or a few other people, let's say, to then prove that, okay, we may not know the intent, but because multiple people have experienced in the workplace, that's what would make a claim stronger than just an individual experiencing it.
It's awful. It should not be that way. And if you look at like EEOC data, what you'll see a lot of times is there's claims out there. I think it's really important to kind of caveat this data. Very few people report it. And if they report it internally, and that doesn't make it into national EEO statistics. So those are just a tiny drop in the bucket of what we see. But, a lot of times you see complaints come forward for race discrimination, sex discrimination, whatever that may be, and it fails. What wins an overwhelming majority of the time is retaliation. And this is really important for people to remember. So say I'm your boss and I've singled you out as a white man, you still could have a claim against me and say you have a hard time proving that and you can't. I'm harassing you, I'm torturing you, I'm horrible to you, but you can't prove that my intent was based on your gender or your race or anything else. And you lose that case. It doesn't matter from the standpoint that you have engaged in lawfully or legally protected activity. And so whether your claim wins or not is irrelevant in the world of harassment. And again, I'm not saying this as an attorney. I'm not an attorney. This is just my understanding as an HR practitioner. And so if anything negative happens to you afterwards, you can make a claim saying, well, she's retaliating against me because I brought this claim against her. And it flips the script. Now I have to prove as the employer that I did not do this based on what happened. So now the burden of proof falls on me, which is much harder. And that's where a lot of employers lose. And so that's part of what I do with like these leverage labs that I create for the general public is to understand some of these nuances as a means to protect themselves as they go through that process. So it can still be scary to file a claim. You might feel unprotected when you file a claim and you may lose if you file that claim, but you could win in the longer term sense and begin to affect some change.
And what happens if there are competing claims? An employee or ex-employee, depending on if they're still employed at the company, but they put forth a claim and then the employer puts forth a claim for whatever reason to protect him or herself, maybe out of embarrassment of
Or in
their
some
own.
cases, they've both done things wrong, and I've dealt with all of that.
How do two claims go up against each other? I don't think it's as simple as, oh, they offset. I think that there has to be some type of mediator to determine who's at fault and what circumstances, depending on which party, correct?
Yeah, you treat them as both valid claims. They both have merit until you figure out otherwise. You investigate them the exact same. You just break them apart, and they're two different instances, and you plow on down the road and you follow. So there's a lot of really great processes in place for doing this. And so it's supposed to be a neutral, objective, fact finding mission. Now, a lot of times that falls apart, and we see it fall apart in grotesque ways, like Sherm, for example, who was just sued. I think a jury awarded 11.5 million for a race discrimination claim, which is a scathing indictment on the failures of HR training when they're, the flagship of this field. And during the trial, it came out that the person who did the investigation had only taken like 1 hour of training. And here this is supposed to be a model of how that works and didn't do a very good job. And so, for me, what I tend to look at, because I've had these cases come up a lot, and usually they fall apart pretty quickly. If somebody's not acting with integrity, if they're coming from a place of fear, especially if they're bringing that really strong emotion in there, the facts will present themselves. In my long experience with this, everything comes out. Also, too, AI is kind of introducing an interesting element with that. And so there was about a year ago where I had a case just like you described. I had employees come to me saying, our boss is terrorizing us. And I go to talk to the boss, and the boss says, no, they're lying, files a counterclaim saying it's basically like defamation. But the boss had recorded all of his calls. The boss used AIs as a note taker. The boss presented me with the evidence against the boss. And so we're now entering into that space where ever since COVID, investigations write themselves. And, with all this pressure to use chat more and more and more for their communications, even just you can now easily access those chat conversations and almost get into people's heads where they're saying, hey, ChatGPT or whatever internal chat we're using, I want you to do this, this, and this. Come up with an email to fire this person. Come up with an email to punish this person. So there's smoking guns abound. So it's not something anyone should be afraid of. And then if you're dealing with something where you're at the top of an organization and there's significant power imbalances that they're coming through that, anyone that's going to be credible or they want an investigation to be considered credible needs to take it outside. You go hire an outside investigator, outside law firm to come in there and take care of this process for you so that it's a believable result.
Very interesting, very fascinating, very in depth. And I love the fact that, especially in your field, people who are in HR capacities or like yourself who have headed up HR departments and been an integral part in making sure that they run as smoothly and effectively, that it is so vital to have, the strength and the fortitude and to have that thick skin to be able to really deal with all of the tolls of managing a department that for it to run effectively and smoothly, again, it goes back to relationship building. The relationship building between an HR department and the people who work at the company is so vital because it's the conduit of making sure that at the executive level who's running a company and the employees who are working for the executives that both groups have a safe space to talk to HR, but therefore HR, it really has to take pivotal steps into making sure that with every claim or with every upset or whatever situation or scenario arises, obstacle, that it comes to a conclusion where both sides, were heard and respected and were given the time to go through the proper steps with HR's guidance to come to a determination of how this, outcome should happen, right? But with everything we talked about, it doesn't mean it stops there because there needs a lot more commentary from others and input to be able to, from experts like yourself to say, okay, this is what works great at this company. But again, going back to a universal governing body, like there needs to be something across the board that companies can go to. So anytime a situation arises, you have a precedent to go to and that it's not novel and that, you're feeling constrained by a lack of resources or input or people from the outside who really don't understand cultural aspects or the culture inside an organization. And because this podcast is about relationship building and team environment, relationship building is again so critical in HR. And you also point to how interesting enough DEI has helped white women. I would love to, for my audience, I mean, love to learn about that aspect too, what research and data is behind there. But again, just going back to the relationship building aspect and how relationship building can continue to be as strong as it can be in terms of making sure there's no communication breakdown to allow for HR in a team environment to be able to work effectively for all parties involved in the organization.
So I think for me, when I look at like, as a chief of HR, like where you sit in an organization, you've got the team underneath you, you've got the, global environment of folks you're trying to protect or serve, and then you've got, folks that are above you. And so I always anchor on, safety and this idea of fairness because it's really hard to argue with fairness. And so for me, first and foremost, for my team, I want them to understand that I'm the outer shell of the organization. If anything gets too ugly or they're feeling outranked or they're feeling like they're not in a safe space, they know that they can come to me and pitch it to me and I will have their back and I will protect them and I will pick up any ugly stuff and I will run interference. I also am very, very particular about who I hire. And so if I'm looking at someone joining the team, especially if I know that they're going to be tied into some component of employee relations or something along those lines, I'll ask them during the interview process. I'll throw out a hypothetical. You're at a meeting and it's you and the CEO makes a racist remark. What do you do? And I wanna see in that moment that, and I've hired great people who've thrown out comments like, "Well, I might be really scared and uncomfortable, but I think it's important to say something in that moment." And I'm like, "You're my person. I can teach you everything else." So much of HR is being automated out, and I want it to be. I don't want admins. I want people who can handle hard conversations and aren't afraid to speak up, even if they're on the wrong side of a power imbalance. If they just have that willingness, I will work with them and I will protect them. I also think, part of safety too is, being really open and transparent about mistakes. I'm the first person to say, "Hey, I screwed up." And I don't just do that to make sure that we can fix it. I want people to always feel safe enough to say, whether, the error is mine or somebody else's, that I can come forward and talk about that. And I'm not going to be bludgeoned for it because I can never fix problems if I don't know they exist. And that just can't happen when there's an element of fear there. And then when I look at what goes on above me in an organization, it goes back to what we talked about before with relationships and even in diplomacy. It's like, is there that baseline established? And so, with executives, with peers, with anybody at that level, I'm reaching out right away. I want coffees. I want to hear from them. I want to know them. I want to build some sort of rapport so that if something bad happens, this is not the first time I'm coming to them, but there's already some relationship and some trust built there. And then likewise, I try and create a sense of safety for them. It's very lonely at positions at the top. And so I want them to be able to talk out loud, say things that may not be correct with the further aim of, okay, this is where you're coming from. Let me help you get to a place where this is going to go better. It's going to go better for you. It's going to go better for the employee and it's going to go better for the company. And so there also has to be safety there, even when people are coming with views that I do not agree with at all. My goal is not to beat them or argue with them or whatever. My goal is to pull them out as much as possible for the safety and sake of the employee so that they're entering into that world of fairness and that they're getting that protection they deserve. And so managing up is really a key component of that. And, even though there's sometimes where I hear things and I'm like, "Oh my God, that is disgusting." And I am so angry. I think about where I want to go and what outcome I want. And I keep engaging along those lines and pushing. So like I make a lot of people uncomfortable, but I do it from the framework of I'm the nicest bad cop you'll ever meet. Like we're going to have this conversation, but I'm gonna do my best to separate you from the problem. I'm gonna sit next to you on the same side of the table. I'm gonna be that mom that's gonna give a talking to about why we need to move from place A to place B. And I'm gonna let you know that I'm not gonna go away and I'm not gonna back away from my position while we're doing that.
Yes, all valid points and observations, and again, valid experiences that you've had where you are an expert in diplomacy, you're an expert in employee relations, you're an expert in really commanding the attention of people who respect the position that you're in and that you are a voice of trying to help them and you are a voice of being someone who can normalize a situation that if it becomes irregular or if it becomes where it's counterproductive or there are people who are trying to disrupt or hurt others, that I like how you said you're the nicest bad cop, right? Because you are someone who you're fair, but you're also going to be someone who is going to call balls and strikes on both sides. You are somebody who has experience of knowing what it's like to, calm a situation down and for people to not take advantage or to try to disrupt, the flow or productivity of the company or organization or in a division and of a company where there are sadly bad apples and bad actors everywhere. And you are in a very tough position, but at the same time, you are in a very gratifying position because the world needs people like you, Kimberly Williams, who, because of your experiences, you are the right person to be put in a situation, especially with the Fair Path project, to work with so many companies across the country and around the world who are, looking to you and looking for your guidance, people who are transitioning out of companies into new companies. And I know you've talked about how you are always trying to help others, go through their issues or problems or what they've experienced. And it's people like you that make people feel good that you could be a sounding board and that you could, really help them and talk them through steps of how to help themselves and others who they care so deeply about. My last couple of questions: where do we go from here in terms of with the Fair Path project, what you hope to accomplish in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years before the next decade, 2030 and beyond? Are there pieces of literature out there, published works where people can go to for further research, or there are things that you've read, things that you've heard, people you've talked to? I know that you alluded to some earlier on in our interview where people can educate themselves and become more knowledgeable about how HRs work, because then it can allow them when they're applying for their next jobs and when they're joining a new team and being a part of a new culture and they want to try their very best to put their best foot forward and to fit in, that unfortunately you don't know a situation until you're in it. And so it doesn't come up probably in the application process. It's not going to come up in a job description. So what advice would you give there? And any final thoughts on relationship building and team environment? Any words of wisdom?
Yeah, so the Fair Path Project, we actually have a list of resources that are a growing list of resources on our website. So there's a tab right at the top that'll point to that. And we've carved it up based on whether you're, employee, potentially a targeted employee bullying, folks who work in HR, and then even folks who run companies that are interested in trying to get ahead of this and want to be a champion of good culture. And then we even have like recommended reading and books and all these things that can help you build that vocabulary and build those muscles for that. We're going to be hosting a series of leverage labs across the United States in 2026, and we're actually looking to put together a big event, hopefully having a formal announcement soon in Washington D.C. at the end of August, which would be kind of like a national convening of all the ways that employees can gain leverage in these conversations, understand their rights more deeply, understand the mysterious processes that can be associated with, labor and employment, and how to effectively build leverage in these conversations. It doesn't have to be aggressive, it doesn't have to be scary, but how they can arm themselves with information. And then we'll be doing a series of smaller in-person events in different cities and some virtually as well. Long term, I'm looking at just putting out as much information as possible so that people understand these rights, developing kind of a research arm where there's so many creative legal maneuvers that attorneys are figuring out in terms of how to help bullying victims that most people have no idea exist, and making that kind of a research arm where people can go to the Fair Path Project so anyone who's in any type of pain can find help in that site. And so, some examples might include like if you live in Texas, Texas is really aggressive on breach of contract claims, which means if your employee handbook states that they will protect you over bullying and these other types of things and they don't, you may have a claim there, which is really important to know because you may have more protection than you think in this particular area in that particular jurisdiction. New York has really strong workers' comp law. So if you're bullied at work and your doctor documents that and you file a workers' comp claim, you may be entitled to have your therapy covered, your time off covered. And so these are really important things for employees to know. And so the whole point is to kind of bridge this gap between the moment of harm and the strongest remedy, which is an employment lawyer. And there's so much space in between. And the employment lawyer may be like, well, I need $10,000 before I can help you. And who has that when they're afraid of losing their job? And employment lawyers are looking for a set of documentation that most people don't know they need to collect. And so filling in that gap with, resources, support, and training so people can be well positioned to work their way up to an attorney if needed. But in the very act of positioning yourself to work for an attorney, you're actually building up more safety at work and you're showing up differently. And that also can begin to help you. I also want to work at reinventing HR. HR has never been respected or protected enough to effectively do its job. And so, we kicked that off with this HRCI training program. It's a 3-hour training program. We just had our first class. We're going to be offering these monthly, but we're starting to kick off pilot programs that can specifically help HR and other professionals build up tangible leadership skills through kind of more practical areas in order to show up differently at work that would really support this momentum we're hoping to build. And then last is just building up a network of bully attorneys. So this is kind of an emerging field of law where we're starting to see more and more law firms that actively post and advertise themselves as someone who can help with workplace bullying, even if it's not a slam dunk harassment or discrimination case, and that are working on things, whether that's the breach of contract claim that we talked about, or, intentional infliction of emotional distress, shareholder derivative suits, all these other levers that could potentially be pulled. I want to basically create a network so that we're helping employees who've been through this horrible, horrible situation learn how to document in the way that a lawyer needs them to, so that they are showing up with a win, and that attorney is now well placed to be able to say, okay, I can review very quickly. This is a good claim and I can help this person, and bring all these parts together so we can begin affecting change.
Sure. And when you think of where our nation's largest cities are, whether in Pennsylvania, or Florida, California, Illinois, and I'm not just naming those states, and when you just look at all 50 states, but obviously there are states that have larger populations than others, does that really make a difference from the standpoint of just access to resources if you're, let's say, in Philadelphia versus Omaha, Nebraska? Depending on where people live, are they going to still have the same access to resources? And are they still going to be in a position where, hey, I don't feel isolated from what I'm experiencing? Meaning that I may not have access to the same caliber of attorneys or personnel that maybe what you might have in some of the nation's largest cities.
Yeah, 100%. Jurisdiction matters a great deal. I mean, unfortunately, like protection for employees is almost non existent in Alabama, but it's incredibly strong in California. Now, it doesn't mean that, there's no hope for someone who's in Alabama. There could be other levers to pull. For example, a lot of times in these big states like New York and California, I think I've seen it in Colorado. If you work to the benefit of, say, a California employer, you may be able to file a claim in California. And that's really significant because that means that Alabama employer, the employee probably doesn't want to file a claim in Birmingham, but they definitely would, in California. And so there may be an attorney that can help them there. Most people don't know that. And the other thing that, I think even having community can be really powerful. Understanding that you're not alone in this can be really powerful. It can change how you show up. It can change how you find voice and how you can leverage a situation. But I think that no matter where you are, there are some baseline things that you can do. Like 100% always document, always. You have nothing to lose by doing it. There's great AI tools out there that will help you document quickly. Whether you file a complaint or you don't file a complaint, it's just really important to have that kind of record that is contemporaneous, meaning time stamped, and just the facts, no color or anything else, but just having that there. And to always file a workers' comp claim. Even if it's not compensable, it still puts the employer to some degree in the hot seat. And so you're triggering an outside investigation. And so your safety always lives outside the walls of a bullying organization, not inside. That's where their power lives. So anything that even suggests you can take it outside is going to make them pay attention to a claim in a way that they wouldn't if you're just whispering with inside their walls where they feel like there's going to be no accountability. Talking to your doctor is also so, so important to say, I'm here because of work stress. I'm here because of all of this stuff, because you don't know how the rules will change. You don't know what will happen if things escalate. And so you never want to be in that position where you're like, oh, if only I'd gone back and tracked things over the last 3 years to show this pattern of stuff. Even if it's small, even if I think there's a tiny chance that something could go wrong, I immediately start taking notes on something. And if they go nowhere, they go nowhere. Didn't take up a ton of time, but very rarely that's the case.
Sure, and I almost wonder if companies should have like an on-call medical professional or therapist to talk them through certain situations that are, and I don't know how that would work with HIPAA and all of that, and if that's, legally possible. But, in addition to HR, that there's somebody contracted at an organization that if there is any type of abuse or any type of PTSD or something where the person really loves where they work. And maybe it just requires, if there's a claim against the person who's abusing that person, that that person who did the abusing is trying to still keep his or her job, and they put forward their claim for whatever reason, but they're trying not to be terminated at their work, and that maybe there could be some type of efforts before potential termination on to one of the parties, that they can work through any disagreements or work through any issues through a licensed medical professional. I don't know if that's even possible because, again, when someone gets terminated, I would imagine it's on their record in some type of capacity because the next employer is going to say, well, tell me about your last job and what happened. I think that person is required to say, well, I was terminated from my last role, but I'm not sure. I'm not an attorney, but I was just curious if you knew about what do people do in that situation in terms of, would it be necessary to have some type of medical professional who could be, contract with an organization who can deal with those issues? Or is the company going to say, if you're going to seek medical attention or help in any capacity, it has to be done outside the organization?
Pretty much everyone has an EAP that they can go ahead and reach out to, and it can be confidential, and you just say, "Hey, I'm dealing with a stressful work situation of any kind." But we are seeing more and more of that happening. And what's interesting from an HR context is somebody will complain like, "Hey, I'm being bullied." And they're like, "Oh, so sorry, you're being mistreated. Here's our EAP. Go call that number." Well, now a record's just being created, and there's a liability component to that. That means the company's on notice and employees being harmed, and they're not really addressing it. And then two, if they're working with a psychiatrist, you now have therapy notes that are documenting harm. And if there's a prescription or there's other things that go on there. And so if it does turn into like a discrimination or harassment claim, I've heard plenty of plaintiff side counsel that like love those notes, because it ups damages in some areas. And so it can be really beneficial to an employee to have that. We also have resource lists for outside whistleblower organizations. So, in other words, a hotline that goes outside of an organization so that you can speak with attorneys and things are kept confidential and then they're shared out in a very careful way with the employer. And there's a benefit to the employer having this because if people don't trust and they're too scared, then you don't know about the problems and you can't fix them and they could end up blowing up in a pretty bad way. But then it creates safety and cover for those who are bringing that in, that they won't face some sort of retaliation. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get at. For me, by and large, I do not trust organizations that are trying to control the process. If you're really committed to integrity, you shouldn't be afraid to let someone outside kind of handle that for you. Folks that are bringing it in the house, there's usually a reason, and it's not the best one. And so, not 100%, but that those are kind of my thoughts there. And then in terms of if you're leaving an organization, and you were terminated, especially if it was retaliatory, you don't have to disclose that at all. There's plenty of people that don't. Of course, I would never recommend that somebody lie. So like if somebody asked you directly in an interview, were you terminated? I would question the interviewer and whether you want to go to the company. But all you have to say is we parted ways. You don't have to give all those details. And in fact, if they call and ask, for references, there's very, very specific legal rules and, that govern what can be said. So whoever they're checking references with, they can't trash you. They can't talk about things. A lot of times it's just simply what are the dates of employment, confirming that, certain facts can be verified. Like, was this their title? Did they start this date? Did they end this date? And then sometimes they'll say, would you hire this person again? They may say no, and then they can take what they want with that. But I don't think folks should be afraid of that. In fact, what I encourage as much as possible is when I've left bullying environments, I was very direct in my interviews of saying, I don't want to work for a toxic boss. And that blew up some interviews and I didn't care. And, I would tell recruiters, I'm like, this isn't the right place for me. I'm not doing this. And they're not going to like me either. And so if I'm dealing with a CEO in an interview, I don't feel like they have a backbone, we're not a good fit. And it's better to know that up front. And anywhere people feel safe enough to do that, the more that comes out in these critical conversations, moments higher, the more people are going to pay attention to it. fully recognize in this economy, though, that not everybody feels that safety to do that. So, there's certainly, I wouldn't begrudge anyone who's trying to feed their family for not engaging in that space that would be understandably unsafe. But, I know in places where I felt safe enough to do that, it has been impactful.
Very vital information. It's so imperative for people to have these conversations amongst family, friends, colleagues, and that transparency that I hope continues to strengthen wherever people work at, whatever the companies are, that companies need to do better. But again, it's all about accountability. I love how you talk about accountability, and it's not just accountability at the top, it's accountability with every individual of any company, of any organization, firm, and really, again, the strength of human resources. And that's why I love the mission and the passion and the substance of what the Fair Path Project is accomplishing and successfully accomplishing. And it's exciting to see how it grows and develops. And final question, I know that I said that already. If I could provide this sentence, how would you like to fill in the last word of this sentence? The Fair Path Project is leading a movement called.
Accountability.
Yes, I love that. Well, thank you so much, Kimberly, for being with me today on the Wave Capital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment, for being my 97th guest. I'm really glad for you to be a part of the speaker series, and I've learned so much from you today. And I hope my audience, and I'm sure that they have learned so much as well.
Thank you for having me.
You take care.